Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and it's the day before Thanksgiving. We will be foregoing a program on Thanksgiving, but I think I've got something to hold you over until then. One of the things that really strikes me about the way that media takes more of an advocacy position, in fact, the news media particularly, is less about just giving us the objective facts and more about steering us in the direction of what we're supposed to think. And I know for some people that's like, well, what's the problem with that? The problem is that's really not their jobs. We're supposed to have facts. We make up our minds. We don't need adverbs and labels that lead us to some predestined conclusion. But it all comes down to, well, why don't you care enough about this issue? And you'll see with the issue that we're going to bring up here regarding the Respect for Marriage Act, which is very likely to be voted on here soon. It's going to be it's a distinction that's worth knowing. I want to start with a little quote here from a friend named T.K. Coleman. T.K. Coleman is with the Foundation for Economic Education. He posted this gem the other day on Facebook, and I thought, I really have to share this. People be like, but bro, you have to care. You can't just not care, bro. You need to know about all the things in order to be informed, bro. You're going to lose if you don't keep up with the news, bro. And TK's response is, miss me with that. The information that matters most ain't being thrown in your face and shoved down your throat. Now, I assume that you want to be informed. I don't think any of us really wants to go around being misinformed or uninformed. But what you focus on really is something that you need to provide the definition of what it means to be informed. Because if you allow the news media to inform you, something very predictable is going to happen. You're going to be either angry or anxious or maybe afraid. And that's by design. In other words, you'll focus on the things they tell you to focus on. You will consider yourself informed, even though in your heart you may still be a sheep because you're not really thinking about the things that matter closest to you. Truth be told, the stuff that matters most probably isn't the stuff that's making headlines. With that in mind, let's move on to the next issue at hand. Here's a headline from KTVB. Idaho senators explain no votes on Respect for Marriage Act. Boise Pride director responds. Now, clearly we're supposed to care about this. And the Respect for Marriage Act has passed a major procedural vote, but Idaho senators voted no for a couple of reasons. Now, they get into a little bit of a definition of what the Respect for Marriage Act does. Congressional sponsors explained the act would require the federal government to recognize a marriage between two individuals if the marriage was valid in the state where it was performed. The bill would not require a state to issue a marriage license contrary to state law. Now, the procedural vote tally saw all Senate Democrats vote yes, with a handful of Republicans crossing party lines also to vote yes. Now, the Republican votes got the act over the procedural hump, but Idaho Senators Mike Crapo and Jim Risch were not among those Republicans who voted yes. This is where Donald Williamson, executive director for Boise Pride, steps in and says, well, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's sad. It would be nice to see them not always vote against marginalized communities and equal rights every single time. We're going to come back to that argument of equal rights. But you need to understand, why would these senators vote against something that obviously, matters a great deal to Williamson? Senator Crapo wrote in a statement that the bill would federalize the law of marriage, mandating that every state follow the other state's marriage laws, establishing private rights of action and Justice Department enforcement. Now, he says, I firmly support states' rights to determine the definition of marriage. Idaho has the constitutional right to define marriage as its voters and duly elected officials determine. Now, whether you agree with him or not, that is a very valid reason he is standing up for states' rights. We don't need to nationalize or federalize marriage in this regard. Likewise, Senator Risch writes, regarding same-sex marriage, Idaho has a constitutional amendment on the books defining marriage as its voters determined, and that is the standard I support. He says the federal government has no business attempting to direct our views on this matter. In addition, this bill lacks crucial religious liberty protections for individuals, schools, adoption agencies, and faith-based organizations that hold valid religious views that disagree with this mandate. And again, this is one of the reasons why you actually saw the LDS Church come out in support, or at least not protesting. You know, it wasn't like they were lobbying for it, but they said, we're not going to stand in the way of this particular law, Respect for Marriage Act, because it includes religious protections, meaning that churches can't be forced to, for instance, in the case of the LDS, to solemnize, same-sex marriages in their temples. Now, for this reason, Utah Senator Mike Lee actually voted against the Respect for Marriage Act because he said it didn't go far enough to protect churches. Let's come back to Mr. Williamson. Williamson says, and every time we see bills like this, it's an attempt to further take a chink in the armor at dehumanizing this whole sect of the population. And when we see them voting against a bill that was nothing more than simply making it so that every state had to recognize the marriage of any couple, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation or whatever, it's disheartening and infuriating. In other words, if we don't get our full support, that's disheartening and infuriating. But when he talks about this being a matter of equal rights, and I mean this with all due respect, any old union is not the same thing as the traditional marriage relationship. And in fact, I'd like to walk you back just a little ways. There was actually a time where there were no marriage licenses. Yeah, it's true. There was a time when the state wasn't involved in marriage. It was primarily a private contract solemnized between the individuals who were, involved. And oftentimes the recording of that marriage was in the family Bible. That's where they would write down what took place, the nuptials and so forth. But primarily it was a religious rite. It was referred to as holy matrimony. When the states began to, well, not just states, when governments began to issue marriage licenses, in the very first case, there was civil war taking place in France. Marriage licenses were one of the ways that one side could deny the other side the rights of inheritance. Well, if the state here doesn't recognize your marriage, then that child is a bastard and therefore has no rights of inheritance. You see how that works? You saw it also applied in things like miscegenation, a very racist kind of thinking, but the state, when it steps in, is enforcing, this is appropriate, this isn't. But above all, it invites the state into something where it wasn't even needed in the first place. And unfortunately, people who were pushing back against same-sex marriage 20 years ago when it was being proposed, the states, I think it was 30-some states passed traditional marriage amendments to their state constitutions, Idaho being one of them. The assurance was, it's never going to get to that. But it not only got to that, now we have the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision, putting a one-size-fits-all solution out there for everybody. And it went very quickly from, look, we just want to be left alone, to let us marry who we want to marry, to bake the cake. Do you see that progression? And again, I mean no disrespect. People should be able to find happiness and they should find joy with the person that they wish to find joy with. But a traditional marriage is capable of something that just any other old union isn't. And that is when a man and a woman are committed to each other in a lifelong relationship, they can create new life. And the shift in getting the states involved and getting government involved in marriage, and particularly marriage licenses, shifts the focus from the children, which are the product of that union, to instead, this is all about an arrangement that's built on the happiness of the adults. The children take a very distant back seat. That's unhealthy in a number of ways, and it actually kind of flies in the face of, a few thousand years of human history, where you look at civilizations, both large and small, advanced and primitive, the primary foundational pairing that you see in society is a man and a woman in a committed lifelong relationship, raising the children that they create together. I'm not trying to be mean when I say this. And again, I'm not suggesting that therefore everybody else should have to suffer. I'm just saying you cannot achieve equality by edict when nature itself doesn't play that game. So hopefully I haven't spoiled too many people's day by pointing this thing out. But really, the government doesn't need to be involved. The federal government doesn't need to federalize marriage. But obviously, it's disappointed the director of Boise Pride. And I don't know, what would it take to get his approval and to make him happy? I guess we'll be hearing about that in days to come. One final thought. I know Thanksgiving is upon us, and there's concern about, is it going to be awkward this year? Is that one uncle who always talks politics going to show up? So here's my nod to that. Here's the conservative uncle waiting for their woke nephews to open their mouth about literally anything at the dinner table this Thanksgiving. Actually, I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. We have a lot to be grateful for, and let's try to keep the contention to a minimum. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how